October 13th, 1974, started like any other Sunday in Briar Glen, Ohio. Quiet, predictable, almost too calm. The trees had already begun shedding their burnt orange leaves, and a thin layer of morning frost clung to the sidewalks. Church bells rang out across town at exactly 9 a.m., echoing through the crisp fall air. Families stepped out of their homes dressed in pressed suits and polished shoes, greeting each other with rehearsed smiles. In a town like Briar Glen, Sunday wasn't just tradition, it was expectation. Margaret Harlow arrived 10 minutes late. Witnesses would later remember the details with unsettling clarity. Her pale blue station wagon rolled into the gravel lot, tires crunching softly. 8-year-old Ethan sat in the passenger seat, staring straight ahead, still wearing his bright red sweater despite his mother reminding him it might be too warm by noon. Margaret stepped out first. She looked distracted. Not panicked, just distant. She scanned the church building before reaching for her son's hand. That small hesitation would replay in people's minds for decades. Inside St. Jude's, the air smelled of old wood and candle wax. The choir was already halfway through the opening hymn when Margaret and Ethan slipped into the third pew from the back on the left side. Mrs. Callahan, who sat directly behind them, later said Margaret kept glancing toward the church office door near the altar. Not at the pastor. Not at the stained glass windows. At the door. Ethan leaned against his mother's arm, swinging his feet just above the floor, unaware of the tension tightening around him. Midway through the sermon, Pastor Harold Bennett paused longer than usual while speaking. Several members recalled how his eyes briefly locked with Margaret's. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't obvious. But it was noticeable. His voice faltered for just a second before continuing, smoother than before. Margaret didn't sing during the final hymn. She didn't bow her head all the way during prayer. Instead, she whispered something to Ethan, something no one could hear, and squeezed his hand a little tighter than necessary. When the service ended at 10:17 a.m., people filtered toward the exit in their usual slow procession of small talk and polite laughter. Someone held the heavy wooden doors open. Someone complimented Ethan's red sweater. A few remembered seeing Margaret step out into the sunlight. Others insisted they never saw her leave at all. The only thing everyone agreed on was this. By the time the church parking lot emptied, Margaret Harlow and her son were no longer part of it. By Monday morning, Briar Glen didn't feel like the same quiet town it had been just 24 hours earlier. Margaret's husband, Daniel Harlow, reported her missing after she never came home Sunday afternoon. He told police dinner had been left half-cooked on the stove. Ethan's school backpack was still by the front door. Margaret's purse sat on the kitchen counter, her wallet untouched. Nothing suggested a planned trip. Nothing suggested a fight. Yet somehow, mother and son had vanished without leaving so much as a footprint behind. Sheriff Lowell Grady began with the obvious place, St. Jude's Church. Deputies questioned Pastor Bennett first. The pastor's tone was calm, steady, almost rehearsed. He claimed Margaret and Ethan left right after the service ended. Said he shook Daniel's hand but didn't remember speaking to Margaret directly. When asked if anything seemed unusual, he simply adjusted his glasses and said, "It was a normal Sunday." The elders of the church echoed the same statement. Every answer sounded clean. Too clean. Congregation members were cooperative, at least on the surface. Mrs. Callahan insisted she saw Margaret walk toward the parking lot. A teenage altar boy swore he never noticed them leave. Another church member thought she saw Margaret step toward the side hallway near the pastor's office. But when deputies pressed for details, people became hesitant. Voices lowered. Eye contact broke. In a town of barely 2,000 people, stories usually traveled fast. This time, they stalled. Then came the attendance sheet. Each Sunday, ushers recorded names in a leather-bound logbook kept in the church office. October 13th's page appeared ordinary, families neatly listed in blue ink. But next to Harlow, Margaret, and Ethan, someone had drawn a single dark line through the names. Not scribbled out. Not crossed angrily. Just one deliberate, straight mark. When Sheriff Grady asked about it, the church secretary claimed it must have been an innocent correction. Yet no one could explain what needed correcting. As the week unfolded, something else became clear. Conversations stopped when deputies entered diners. Neighbors suddenly didn't remember simple details they had mentioned days before. Even Daniel Harlow admitted that Margaret had been asking questions about church finances, but then quickly backtracked, saying he might have misunderstood. It wasn't fear that hung in the air. It was something heavier, something practiced. And beneath the polite smiles and Sunday manners, Briar Glen seemed united in one silent agreement. Whatever happened inside St. Jude's that morning was not meant to be discussed. By the second week of the investigation, Briar Glen had split into two versions of itself. The public version, polite, composed, standing together in prayer circles for Margaret and Ethan's safe return. And the private version, whispered conversations behind closed doors, hurried phone calls that stopped when someone entered the room, curtains that seemed to twitch just slightly at night. In small towns, rumors don't spread loudly. They move low and quiet, like fog rolling over a field. The first rumor targeted Margaret's marriage. Some claimed she and Daniel had been arguing, that she wanted to leave town, that she felt trapped in Briar Glen's slow, suffocating rhythm. But investigators found no evidence of packed bags, secret bank withdrawals, or hidden letters. Friends described her as cautious, devoted to her son, not reckless. And if she truly planned to disappear, why attend church that morning at all? Then a different story began circulating, one that didn't focus on her home life, but on the church itself. Margaret had worked part-time as a bookkeeper for St. Jude's the year before she vanished. It was common knowledge. What wasn't common knowledge was that she had recently stepped away from the position. Some said she quit. Others said she was let go. A local hardware store owner quietly told deputies that Margaret had mentioned discrepancies in land records, properties donated to the church decades earlier under questionable circumstances. But when deputies returned to ask him to repeat the claim on record, he denied ever saying it. 3 days after Margaret and Ethan disappeared, construction permits were filed for urgent structural renovations in the church basement. The request moved through town council faster than anything in recent memory. No public objections. No delays. Within 48 hours, workers were seen carrying cement bags through the side entrance. Heavy equipment arrived before sunrise. The basement windows were boarded up from the inside. When reporters from a neighboring county asked what kind of damage required sealed access, they were told it was water intrusion. Strangest of all, the basement had never been listed as damaged before. Kids in town started daring each other to sneak behind the church at night. They claimed they heard noises beneath the ground, metallic clanging, dragging sounds, something like muffled hammering. Adults dismissed it as imagination. Yet no one could explain why the renovations lasted nearly 14 months. Or why, once completed, the basement door remained locked at all times, accessible only to Pastor Bennett and 2 senior elders. The official explanation was safety concerns, structural reinforcement, liability issues. But in Briar Glen, people had begun noticing something unsettling. The concrete beneath St. Jude's looked newer than the rest of the building. And sometimes, during the quietest moments of Sunday service, when the congregation bowed their heads in prayer, a faint hollow echo seemed to rise from below the pews, as if the foundation itself wasn't entirely solid. By the summer of 1975, the search parties had stopped gathering at dawn. The flyers that once covered telephone poles began peeling at the corners, their ink fading under months of rain and sun. Margaret's face, once sharp and hopeful in the printed photograph, slowly blurred into the background of weathered wood and rusted staples. Ethan's school portrait, with his uneven haircut and shy smile, became just another forgotten image on a bulletin board near the grocery store entrance. Sheriff Lowell Grady did what he could with the resources he had. Bloodhounds were brought in from 2 counties over. Divers searched Miller's Lake twice. Volunteers combed through acres of farmland and wooded trails surrounding Briar Glen. Nothing. No clothing. No footprints. No signs of struggle. Even Margaret's blue station wagon yielded nothing but fingerprints belonging to her and her husband. It was as if the earth had swallowed them whole without leaving a single trace behind. In early 1976, the state police briefly stepped in. Fresh investigators. Fresh eyes. They re-interviewed church officials, reviewed financial records, and examined the basement renovation permits more closely. But the paperwork was clean. Receipts matched invoices. Construction logs appeared orderly and signed. When pressed, Pastor Bennett maintained his calm, measured tone. "We are a house of God," he told them. "Why would we harm our own?" Without physical evidence, suspicion remained just that, suspicion. Meanwhile, St. Jude's didn't shrink under scrutiny. It grew. New stained glass windows were installed the following year. Donations reportedly increased. The church purchased 2 additional acres of land along Briar Road, land that had once been part of an old family farm sold under private agreement. No one questioned where the money came from. No one publicly connected it to Margaret's former bookkeeping role. On the outside, Briar Glen appeared to be thriving. Sunday attendance climbed. Community events expanded. The town's image polished itself brighter than ever. By 1982, the official file labeled Harlow, Margaret and Ethan missing persons was moved from an active cabinet to archival storage. The words "cold case" were stamped across the front in thick black ink. Sheriff Grady retired that same year. At his farewell gathering, he reportedly admitted to a deputy that the case never sat right with him. That something about St. Jude's basement renovations felt too convenient. But feelings weren't evidence. And evidence was what the case never had. As years passed, new families moved into Briar Glen who had never heard the full story. To them, St. Jude's was simply a beautiful old church with a strong congregation. The whispers faded into background noise. The questions lost urgency. And the space beneath the chapel floor remained undisturbed, sealed beneath smooth concrete that no one thought to break open. On the night of April 17, 2023, Briar Glen was hit by the worst storm it had seen in decades. Weather alerts flashed across television screens. Wind gusts tore through power lines, snapping tree branches like matchsticks. By midnight, rain pounded the town so hard it sounded like gravel thrown against windows. And at exactly 12:43 a.m., a violent crack echoed through St. Jude's Church as part of the aging roof gave way. By morning, yellow caution tape surrounded the building. Shingles littered the churchyard. A section of the attic ceiling had collapsed into the pastor's office, soaking decades of paperwork. Restoration crews were called in from Columbus to assess structural damage. The town gathered across the street, watching in uneasy silence as workers carried out waterlogged books, broken wood beams, and filing cabinets swollen from rain. That's when one of the contractors noticed something strange. Behind the north wall of the pastor's office, a wall that blueprints showed should have been solid, there was a hollow sound when tapped. Not insulation. Not standard framing. Hollow. After removing a section of damaged drywall, workers discovered a narrow cavity sealed off by an interior panel that didn't match the rest of the construction. The wood was older, rougher, as if it had been placed there deliberately and forgotten. Inside that hidden space sat a small wooden box. It wasn't locked. It wasn't labeled. Just coated in a thick layer of dust, untouched by time. When the lid was lifted, workers found a leather-bound ledger wrapped carefully in oilcloth. The leather was cracked with age but preserved remarkably well. Embossed faintly on the cover were the years, 1973 to 1975. The discovery was immediately reported to local authorities, who secured the church and removed the box as potential evidence tied to the decades-old disappearance. At first glance, investigators assumed it was just an old financial record. But when Detective Maria Alvarez began turning the pages, she realized this wasn't bookkeeping. The handwriting was personal, detailed, almost confessional. Dates aligned with key moments in Briar Glen's history: land purchases, closed-door meetings, and then October 1974. Several entries from that month were written darker, as if the pen had been pressed harder into the paper. Some lines appeared slightly smeared, like the ink hadn't dried properly before the book was closed. And tucked between two pages near mid-October was something else. A folded document that didn't belong in any church ledger. Detective Maria Alvarez read the October 14, 1974 entry 3 times before saying a word. The room around her felt smaller with every line. The handwriting was steady, deliberate, not rushed, not frantic. That was the unsettling part. Whoever wrote this wasn't panicking. He was documenting. The entry began calmly, almost clinically, referencing a private meeting held after Sunday service. It described Margaret as troubled and unreasonable. But as the sentences continued, the tone shifted into something colder. Margaret discovered the foundation records. She confronted us in my office after service. She threatened to bring state authorities into matters they would not understand. Alvarez flipped the page slowly. The boy was present. He heard everything. Investigators gathered around as the next paragraph grew darker. The writer described a gathering of church elders in the basement that same afternoon. Words like preservation, covenant, and protection of the town appeared repeatedly. It was framed not as violence, but as necessity. A decision made, according to the ledger, to protect Briar Glen from collapse. The entry didn't describe how Margaret and Ethan were stopped. It didn't mention weapons. It simply stated, it had to be handled quietly. Further down the page, the language turned disturbingly symbolic. The earth beneath the chapel will keep our covenant, as it keeps all burdens placed upon it. The foundation must remain unshaken. Detective Alvarez immediately requested excavation permits. Within 48 hours, forensic teams stood inside St. Jude's basement, the same basement sealed for renovations in late October 1974. The concrete floor looked smooth and uniform at first glance. But ground-penetrating radar told a different story. Beneath a section near the center of the room was an anomaly, a hollow pocket roughly 6 feet long. As jackhammers broke through the concrete, the sound echoed unnaturally through the church. Each crack of stone felt like it was disturbing something long meant to stay buried. Workers uncovered a wooden barrier beneath the slab, not part of the original foundation. It had been constructed separately, then sealed over. The air that escaped when the barrier was removed carried a dry, stale odor trapped for nearly 5 decades. Inside the hollow space were 2 skeletal remains positioned side by side. An adult female. A child. Near the smaller remains, partially preserved by the sealed environment, were fragments of red fabric, faded but unmistakable. Forensic specialists worked in silence, documenting every detail. And tucked against the adult remains was something else, a small silver cross pendant, later identified by Daniel Harlow as one Margaret wore every Sunday to church. When the forensic confirmation came back, Briar Glen changed overnight. Margaret Harlow. Ethan Harlow. After 49 years, the missing persons case was officially reclassified as a double homicide. News vans lined the streets outside St. Jude's. Satellite trucks blocked driveways. Reporters stood where children once played after Sunday service, speaking into cameras about corruption, conspiracy, and buried secrets. The town that had once avoided eye contact now found itself under a national spotlight, and the questions weren't going away this time. Detective Alvarez and her team dove deeper into the recovered ledger. What initially seemed like personal reflections revealed something much larger. Pages detailed land acquisitions from the late 1960s and early 70s, properties transferred to church ownership under charitable donation. But attached to the folded document found inside the book were copies of original deeds. Some signatures didn't match. Others belonged to elderly residents who had died shortly after signing. A pattern emerged. Struggling families pressured into signing over land at fractions of its value. Their property later resold to developers tied directly to church elders. Margaret, as former bookkeeper, would have seen it all. Bank transfers labeled as mission contributions were rerouted into private development accounts. Church donations funded real estate expansion. Entire sections of Briar Glen, including the shopping plaza built in 1978, sat on land that once belonged to families who mysteriously relocated or faced sudden financial ruin. The ledger suggested Margaret had compiled evidence. There were references to copies made and documents removed for safekeeping. Investigators began searching for what she might have hidden, something that may still be out there. Arrest warrants followed quickly. 2 surviving church elders, both in their 70s, were taken into custody. Former Pastor Bennett had passed away in 2006, but his name dominated every headline. During questioning, one elder initially denied everything, until confronted with the ledger's handwriting confirmed by forensic analysis. Another requested a lawyer after being shown the excavation photos. The charges extended beyond homicide: fraud, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, racketeering. What had once been whispered rumors were now federal indictments. But even as legal proceedings unfolded, something about Briar Glen remained unsettling. Longtime residents insisted they never knew. Others admitted there had always been stories, late-night meetings, sealed rooms, decisions made without public record. The church building itself stood empty now, fenced off and awaiting demolition. Yet at night, patrol officers reported lights flickering inside despite the power being disconnected. Some claimed it was faulty wiring damaged by the storm. Others weren't so sure. Because if Margaret had truly made copies of those documents before confronting the elders, and if the ledger was only one piece of the record, then whatever built Briar Glen's foundation might not be fully uncovered yet. In the fall of 2024, St. Jude's Church was finally demolished. The stained glass windows were removed. The pews were auctioned off, and the concrete foundation, the same one that had hidden the truth for nearly 5 decades, was broken apart piece by piece until nothing remained but dust and debris. Margaret and Ethan Harlow were laid to rest properly that winter. For the first time since 1974, their names weren't attached to the word missing. But closure doesn't erase silence, because the real question isn't how they disappeared. It's how an entire town looked the other way. How neighbors stopped asking questions. How authority went unchallenged. How faith was used as a shield. Briar Glen still stands today. The streets are paved. The houses are warm. Children still walk to school in the mornings. But if you visit the empty lot where St. Jude's once stood, you'll notice something strange. Nothing grows there. Grass won't take root. Flowers won't bloom. Almost like the earth remembers what it was forced to keep. And maybe that's the most terrifying part of all. Sometimes the truth isn't buried to stay hidden. Sometimes it waits, patient and silent, for someone brave enough to dig it back up.
If you liked this video, don't forget to hit that like button, share it with your friends, and drop your thoughts in the comments below. Most importantly, subscribe and hit the bell icon so the next secret finds you first.